So I think there's many different areas that are really interesting in terms of just understanding the world better, understanding the genetic basis for various traits. How do we manipulate a plant? How does a plant adapt to, for example, high concentrations of metals? That's something that's been in the news recently. Rice has a high affinity for absorbing cadmium, and that has some health consequences. You could ask the plant to turn that around and grow plants on toxic areas and to really incorporate those metals and actually clean up the soil. So how does that happen? How can we use that? Those are interesting areas. How does the plant develop? How does it know when to produce seeds? How can we get a plant to produce more seeds? Those are really interesting areas. One of the key questions is, how do plants respond to pathogen attack? That is something that is of just biological interest. Every plant is confronted with bacteria and viruses and insects. Plants can't get up and run away. They have to respond. They have to respond biochemically, physiologically. How does that happen? Those are just inherently interesting questions just for knowledge's sake. But at the same time, they're extraordinarily important in terms of how do our crop plants, how do we protect them from insects and from viruses and bacteria? How do plants protect themselves from drought or extreme temperature? That's an interesting area. In the Midwest, when it gets really hot on a summer day, the plants, corn plants, go into heat shock and they shut down production. Can we tweak that? Can we make plants tolerant to higher temperatures? As our climates change, there's going to be more variance in the climate, more episodes of extreme temperature and extreme drought. How can plants tolerate that? Some plants do. How do they do that? And can we use that knowledge to incorporate into our crop plants? The relationship between agriculture and the environment is complex. On one hand, by having more efficient crops, crops with higher yields, it allows you to shrink the amount of land that's used. The other side of the coin is that those high yield varieties of crops such as rice and corn and soy and wheat require inputs. They require inputs of fertilizers and pesticides, and that produces some agricultural pollution. And it requires, in many cases, vast amounts of water. And about 80% of the water used in the United States is used for agriculture. So there is a huge environmental footprint because of modern agriculture, but there's also a shrinking of the amount of land. And so it's not a trade-off, it's an imbalance, but it certainly is a complicated situation. So one of the goals of agriculture research as we go forward, one of the challenges for agricultural research is to reduce the environmental footprint. And so how do you do that? Well, you can do it by traditional crop breeding, but we now know that by using methods of biotechnology, genetically modifying various varieties of crops, we have a potential to rapidly expand the number of varieties that might be adaptive and use less inputs, and to also do that in a very quick way, and to do that with multiple crops. So one of the tools for addressing environmental impacts of agriculture is genetic modification.